Hello, hello. It is me, Legendary, and today I'm going to be yapping on about border bases and a couple of key mechanics that come with them. Notably, I'm going to be talking about how zoos, invasion bonuses, and border hotels work, as these are three terminologies that are very prevalent within Foxhole, but are not easily explained to newer players. So the purpose of this video is to showcase how these mechanics work so that you can also be aware of exactly what vets are talking about when they talk about let's create a zoo or let's have an invasion bonus or the opposing team is doing a border hotel. So you can understand what is exactly going on. Do take note that this video is recorded on the 6th of January 2025. This means that this is a dated video and the mechanics may change in the future. This is something that the devs have thought about revamping, so I wouldn't be surprised that in a couple of wars from now, these mechanics may have been revised so that they are no longer prevalent. But for now, let's dive into what these things are and exactly how they occur within Foxhole. Alright, so before we can jump into the three main topics, first we need to talk a little bit about what border bases are and exactly how they spawn and why the devs add them within the game. So for those who don't know, a border base is a world spawned entity or a base that is created at the border of a contested or an invaded border within Foxhole. Whenever you have two regions that are diametrically opposed and one faction is trying to attack into another region owned by the opposing faction, there will be these square concrete bases that spawn along the border. These border bases will only spawn at these contested borders, and they only spawn alongside the roads that lead into the opposing border side. There will always be a matching pair of border bases on either side of the hex, and any team can capture a vacant border base spot as long as the opposing team doesn't control one on the other side. When you capture a border base, then the border base on the other side becomes yours, and it comes with a couple of bonuses. Specifically, it allows players to spawn in the opposing hex from the home region, as well as it comes with a lot of starting supplies, notably soldier supplies, so that the invasion of that region can get started. The devs added border bases to the game because previously, if you wanted to attack into an enemy region, or into a new region essentially, you would have to enter the region and build a bunker base or an encampment inside the enemy's territory. Now, there was a big problem with this because it required a lot of moving parts just to get the invasion started. Notably, you'd need to bring a CV across, or you would have to hammer out one of these bases inside the enemy territory. Now, if you've never built something inside of an enemy territory, you would know that this is incredibly hard, especially once artillery and other larger ordnance is unlocked. Because you might get that bunker base to 99% and then all of a sudden a 120 shell lands on top of it and it drops down to 40% built. And another shell lands on it and then it gets destroyed. So border bases were added in by the devs as a way to counteract the fact that a lot of the defenders could just spawn camp any attempts to build up a base by the attacking force. So it is a necessary mechanic, and because of this, a lot of strategies have developed over the years about how to attack into different regions. Alright, so very important that you understand the basics of how border bases work. I won't go into the specific mechanics of claiming border bases in this video. I'll leave that up to another tutorial video, maybe by Robert or Freak, as they also tend to talk about the in-detail mechanics for these systems within Foxhole. Alright, so let's quickly talk a little bit exactly what happens to create a border base within a border region. So here I have an example of two fictional hexes, and these hexes have two roads that connect between them. when you go up to the edge of one hex and you teleport into the adjacent hex, this is what we call border crossing. Now, in a scenario like this, where the colonial team, which is green, has a sub-region within an adjacent hex, then you don't have any border bases that get created along the region's border itself. However, if one team doesn't have a foothold into the adjacent team and the two hexes are diametrically opposed, meaning the one hex is completely controlled by colonials and the other region is completely controlled by wardens, then you have something that looks a little bit like this. So in this scenario, the wardens destroyed the last remaining town base for the colonials inside of their mostly controlled hex here, and this caused no further spawns to be available for the colonials inside of this right-hand hex. This now means that these two hexes are diametrically opposed, and the border between the two hexes now become a contested border, and this is usually indicated with a red line within the world map. Now, when this happens, a couple of things occur. First and foremost, alongside any roads, there will be a pair of border base husks that appear on either side of the border, and this is the pair that gets connected with each other. In this scenario, any player from either team can run up to these border husks, press E on them, and capture them for their team. Once a border base is captured, the border base on your side of the team basically becomes functionless, but the border base on the other side of the hex that is attacking into the enemy becomes spawnable with all those lovely starting resources available straight away. It is important to note that border bases do not spawn randomly. They have a fixed point that gets created alongside the roads that lead into the opposing hexes. This is why you don't see border bases in naval-only hexes, because there are no roads for the border bases to spawn next to. Now, this is particularly dangerous for defenders when you get into a scenario like this. In this scenario, you can see that there is a warden hex that doesn't have any starting colonial region, it doesn't have any colonial bases within it. Therefore, in this scenario where there are 3 hexes that are bordering this warden hex, you can see that 3 contested borders were created. Now, this leads to a problem if there are multiple roads that lead in and out of this warden hex, because for every single road, you now have the possibility of a border base pair spawning within this particular area. So this is particularly dangerous for defenders, because now, instead of having potentially 1 or 2 spawns of the enemy attacking into your region, you could have multiple spawns that are automatically generated if the enemy manages to capture all those border bases and initiate an invasion. Okay, so now that you understand this mechanic, that you have border bases, they get created whenever there is no remaining spawns for one side in a hex and it's bordering another hex. Now we can take a look at understanding what the first terminology is here, which is a zoo. And what exactly is a zoo, and exactly why do players care so much about this zoo mechanic. So to understand the zoo, we first need to understand what happens when a hex gets invaded by the opposing team. So in this scenario, we have the colonials that are attacking into a warden region here from 3 different contested borders. So in this scenario, the colonials go into the hex and they attack and capture 3 town bases within this warden hex, like so. Now, in this scenario, you have multiple vectors that get attacked, and the colonials push in and capture 3 strategic points, or 3 town bases. Let's say that the wardens then all of a sudden rally and they get their logistics in and they get some regiments to log in or some veteran players to help out, and they decide to push back against the colonial attack and reclaim 2 of these regions, leaving 1 remaining. Now, at this point, the wardens have a decision to make whether or not they want to push all the colonials outside of their region. And this is an important decision to make because it all comes down to player activity as well as willingness to continue attacking the colonial fronts. So when the wardens are in this scenario, they need to consider whether or not they want to destroy the last remaining colonial spawn point for that region. Because remember, if they do this, this will then cause a whole bunch of border base husks to spawn along the edges of all the contested borders, along all those roads that I showed earlier. In this scenario, all the warden players would now have to rush to those points and capture them, or else they would risk running a second incursion, because all the colonials need to do is station troops alongside the border and recapture the border bases the moment that they spawn. So this is a very unfavorable scenario if the defenders are not prepared. So to counteract this, something called a zoo is implemented by the defending players. So in this scenario, we'll turn back the clock a little bit, and here you can see that the wardens have left 1 colonial town base still present inside of their warden-owned region. They intentionally do this because they are creating this phenomenon called a zoo. And a zoo basically just means a controlled enemy base that doesn't get destroyed, so that the regions don't create contested borders in between all the various hexes. So this is an intentionally left enemy base to prevent border bases from spawning alongside the edges of the border, which could cause a lot of trouble if the defenders are not prepared to take them. So in a scenario like this, the wardens are zooing, or they're creating a zoo for the colonials. And they typically do this by spamming a whole bunch of defenses around the remaining colonial town base and making sure that no friendly wardens would go off and destroy that last town base, causing the region to become contested or destroyed. All right, so this is the main thing about a zoo. It's keeping the last enemy town base alive intentionally so that border bases don't spawn. And again, this is typically done by spamming pillboxes around the town base. And even though the colonial players can still spawn inside the town base from world spawn, they typically have a bit of a monstrous task of breaking out or breaking free of that zoo, because typically speaking, this means that they would have to sneak in logistics to basically get enough resources to fight back against all the defenses that the defenders, in this case the wardens, intentionally build around the town base itself. Now, the key motivation behind building all these defenses is to drain the remaining shirts within the town base itself. So shirts is a limited resource, and once the shirts run out, or the soldier supplies run out, then the town base is literally just a ghost town. The colonials can't spawn from it, and the wardens no longer need to spend so much time attacking any infantry that spawn within the base spawn itself. So now they can focus on rallying their logistics, making sure that they have enough resources, and when the time is right, they can now destroy that town base and then control when the border bases spawn for that particular region. So they can mount a counterattack, or they could focus on one contested border and leave the other ones to be captured and then get those destroyed with partisan work or with tanks. Okay, So zoos are very important in this scenario because now the wardens have complete control over how the border bases get to spawn. So now they'll intentionally destroy the town base, but they'll have troops ready along the border to capture any border bases that spawn. And now the tables are turned. Previously, the wardens were the defenders, but now using a zoo, they flip the scenario and now they can be the aggressors because they control when the border bases spawn and they can coordinate, usually through large regiments, of who captures what border base and what key targets they then get to attack into these three colonial hexes. All right, so that's the main idea behind the zoo. It's to keep an intentional enemy world spawn within your hex, prevent border bases from continuously spawning, and then when you're ready, you destroy the town base, and then you capture all the border bases, and then you attack into the enemy regions. Now, one of the questions that a lot of people have is creating a zoo a good idea? Is it a good idea to have an intentional enemy world spawn inside of your region? And does it not contribute to some risk factors depending on how and when it is set up? Now, for the most part, and in my personal opinion, I think creating a zoo that is controlled by a large regiment that is operating within that particular region is a good idea, because large regiments can coordinate very powerful first strikes into enemy hexes. So if there is a large regiment that is advising that players do not destroy a zoo or break the zoo, as we call it, then typically speaking, you should adhere to those players' strategic idea, simply because they have the manpower and probably the logistics to attack into the enemy regions. If you are just a random player and you decide to break a zoo or to destroy the last remaining point, and the enemy captures all the border bases, that is a serious risk to your team, because the enemy will now have multiple spawns into your defending region, and if the large regiments that are coordinating those defenses aren't ready for it, they can easily be crushed and overwhelmed. So always heed the warnings of large regiments when they say that there is a zoo in place. It's typically for a very good reason. Now, on the flip side, when you're a large regiment and you are coordinating keeping a particular region as a zoo, there are two really big risks that you need to be careful of. The first thing is you need to be careful of the random friendly partisan that is just a little bit too explosive, crazy, and they go off and destroy the relic base when you're not ready. At this point, you will then run into a scenario that I outlined a little bit before, where you now have multiple border bases that spawn potentially on the enemy side, and you have to then coordinate a quick response force to go and destroy those border bases before the enemy can mobilize heavy ordnance into your particular hex. So there is a very, very real risk that a zoo can be turned on its head if a friendly partisan, goes and destroys the last remaining spawn point and then invokes a border base scenario like that. Additionally, you also need to worry about enemy partisans sneaking supplies into the remaining spawn point as well. Be very, very clear. The moment that specific base can get supplies again, the enemy can then spawn from the world spawn into that hex and immediately start attacking. So if the enemy sneaks in a truckload of havoc charges and soldier supplies and partisan uniforms or scout uniforms, then there is a very real risk that your bases are vulnerable to these partisan attacks. And if it's a very relaxed hex and people aren't very focused on fighting into that particular zoo through just the typical low pop hours, you can run the risk of that world spawn immediately becoming a deployment zone for the enemy faction. So that is something that you need to watch out for. And again, this is why we typically leave the management of zoos to the large regiments themselves, because they can coordinate exactly who and when those resources get depleted, etc. All right, so that's the first idea behind zoos. The next thing to talk about is the invasion bonus. So this is another border mechanic that heavily focuses on how border bases work when you are attacking into an enemy region. So let's take this example here. This time we are the colonials, and we are going to attack into this warden-controlled region. So here we have a zoo that is set up, and the first thing that the colonials will do when they're ready to attack into a warden region is to destroy the zoo to create the border bases to spawn. So the moment the last spawn point for the wardens inside of our territory is captured or destroyed, then the 2 border bases will spawn along the edge. The border itself will become a contested border, and what we'll do is we'll typically capture those border bases, and now we have 2 spawn points that get into the opposing region. Now at this point, we need to talk a little bit about player caps. All regions within Foxhole have a player cap to them, and this is to prevent the servers from not overloading with too many things happening at the same time. For any given region, the total number of players on either side is capped at 120 players. That means at most, any particular region can only have 120 players of any of the 2 factions fighting on that side. Now, this is quite important because when one army is attacking into another region, that cap is limited by the number of defenders. So in this scenario, let's say that these border bases spawn, and there are currently 74 warden players logged into this region ready to defend it. Now, under normal circumstances, the amount of colonials that are allowed to spawn inside of that hex would match the number of defenders. So in this case, because there's 75 wardens, there would be 74 wardens, there would be 75 colonials that could then go and attack those number of defenders, so equal numbers. However, when we are in a scenario where it's a contested border and there are no other sub-regions owned by the attacking force, so in this case there's no colonial sub-hexes inside the region itself, the game allows up to the maximum number of players to go and play inside of that region for the attacking side. So in this scenario, the colonials get an invasion bonus that allows them to break the cap of the number of players allowed in that region. Now, I will be honest, this is the exact number of how many players are allowed inside of the region is a little bit of speculation. We don't know the exact numbers, or maybe some of the really large regiments do know the exact number of players that are allowed inside of a region above the normal defenders count. But for argument's sake, let's just say that this gets set to the maximum. Right. So when one faction or when one army attacks into a opposing enemy's region and they don't own any town bases or relic bases inside that region, they get an invasion bonus, which means they can spawn in more players, or they can spawn players up to the maximum cap, and the defending players are basically just capped at the number of actual players willing to log in and defend their region from assault. So this bonus is maintained as long as the attacking force does not capture any regions, meaning they destroy an enemy relic or town base, they build a CV, and then they go and build up the blueprint so that it gets completed. As long as the attackers don't do this, then they maintain their invasion bonus. So in this scenario, the colonials pushed into this southern hex here, or this southern region. They destroyed the town base, but they do not intentionally build it back up. They leave it dormant. And if they were to theoretically build it up, so they get a CV, they build up the town base, and the town base gets finished in its construction, immediately at that point, the colonials will lose their invasion bonus, which means that whatever the number of defenders are, that's what the player cap will be. And in a scenario like this, any additional players that are trying to get into that region for the colonial team will have to go into a attacker's queue. All right, so this is something that the invasion bonus tries to circumvent. You don't want to just go into a region and immediately just capture the first town base. You would rather keep that momentum going, destroy multiple targets, and then capture them all at once. And this is exactly what large regiments do when they attack into a contested border like this. They'll set up their attack patterns, they'll coordinate with their teams what and who they're going to attack with, and then they will go into the hex and try and blitzkrieg as many town bases and relic bases as possible. So this is a very, very common scenario that a lot of large regiments implement. They will get across the border, destroy the first relic or town base, and then they will intentionally not build it up and attack multiple other targets so that they can keep this invasion bonus of having a max number of players to be able to spawn inside of this contested region. All right. After the attackers are satisfied with their gains, so let's say they destroyed 2 town bases and a relic base, for example, what they will then do is they will intentionally go and build up those relic bases to tap them. Tapping them basically just means that the previous owners lose all the upgrades that they have on those bases, and then the invasion bonus wears off. The border is no longer contested because there are now world spawns for the attacking team in the defender's hex, and the number of players that can spawn is now capped based on the total number of defenders for that particular region. Right. One additional thing that the invasion bonus gives, and this is something that is not often talked about but is also very, very important, is the fact that when you are attacking into a region, you are limited by the number of deployment zones that you have from the world spawn. So the world spawn is when you're on the home region and you're selecting a region to attack, you get shown a whole bunch of options that you can spawn into. Now, normally, you're only ever allowed to spawn into a region if it has one of the 2 following things. It must have a world base, which is a relic or a town base, that is present inside of your own sub-region within the hex, or you can spawn at a bunker base that has the deployment point upgrade ticked inside of it. However, if you are attacking into a region and there are border bases up, the rules change a little bit. So in a scenario like this, where the colonials are attacking into the Warden Hex and they've captured the border bases, these now become world spawn locations that you can deploy into. This is why you often see deployment diamonds inside of in the world spawn map in the home region, because this region is being attacked into, and you can spawn on the border and assist in the attack itself. Additionally, as long as the attacking force keeps their invasion bonus, any bunker bases or encampments that they construct inside of those regions will also have the deployment zone automatically available for any additional soldiers to spawn into. So that's why this is not a very uncommon sight to see on either the colonial or the warden side when there is an attack ongoing. The attackers will intentionally leave the regions destroyed, so not rebuilt, because they want as many players to spawn in these various bases without the need of tacking all the way up to the deployment zone upgrade for bunker bases and encampments. The moment the attacking team decides to capture a town base or a relic base, then this bonus gets lost, and all these world spawns will immediately switch off, and the only remaining spawn will be from the previous numbers that I had up here, which is, or the previous examples that I have up here, which is the relic base, town base, or bunker bases with the deployment zone upgrade. All right, so this is another advantage of keeping your invasion bonus. So typically, if you are in a small regiment and you're not coordinating within an attacking region, it's very important that you listen to the large regiments who are busy deciding when and where to attack those particular key points. Don't just randomly go and rebuild relic bases, specifically when border bases are in play, because you might get a lot of regiments yelling at you because they are busy coordinating and figuring out the exact targets to destroy, so that when they do build up those relic and town bases, they have actually gained some ground for their coordinated attack. All right, so the final thing to talk about is a border hotel. Now, this used to be a mechanic that was very much exploited by both teams in the wars between, I think it was like from 110 to 116. And this is a very, very annoying mechanic that a lot of large regiments use to basically prevent players from crossing into a border, even if they were attacking into it. So let me explain exactly the headache that we had to deal with that is a border hotel. But luckily, there is a silver lining to the story at the very end. So the way a border hotel worked is in a scenario like this, where you have the wardens that are attacking into a colonial region like this. It's a contested border, and there are border bases that they've captured, and they're busy pushing into the colonial region itself. So let's just assume that they're busy attacking. They might be using the invasion bonus, doing all those mechanics to attack into the colonial hex to push the front in that direction. One of the things that the devs added to prevent spawn camping players that cross into a border is by introducing something called the rapid decay zone. Now, the rapid decay zone is prevalent on every border edge, not just any attacking or defending ones. But here I just want to illustrate the point of how the rapid decay zone benefited people who used border hotels as a mechanic. So within the rapid decay zone, and it's usually much smaller than this, that's just an illustration, there is a certain portion of distance between the edge of the hex going into the hex that you are not allowed to construct in without some severe penalties. And this is what we call the RDZ, or the rapid decay zone. And if you decide to build defenses or a bunker base or static defenses inside of this zone, then your defenses or whatever you build will basically decay within 24 hours, and there is no way for you to prevent that from happening. It is a mechanic that the devs added to prevent border spawn camping. However, one of the things that people found out is there was a way to build inside of the rapid decay zone on your side of the hex when you're attacking into an enemy hex without the border base or any of the surrounding structures built near it decaying from this intended mechanic. So because of this, a lot of large regiments would go and build a very large bunker base next to their side of the hex's border bases, which resulted in things that looked a little bit like this. So here you can see this is a picture of a colonial border base, where it's a colonial border base like this, and there's a bunker base that is completely built up and concreted around it. Now, I'm not going to explain how this mechanic was used and how it was implemented, but this was a non-intentional mechanic that a lot of large regiments used to basically spawn camp players when they tried to attack back into their side of the hex. So some people argued that this was a exploit. I would agree with them. I do think that this was an exploit, and both factions used this in separate wars, and thankfully the devs did do something to address this. But just to give you an idea of how incredibly annoying this mechanic was, here is an example from Reddit by Human420, which showed what it would look like when a group of colonial players crossed a border and attacked into a warden bunker base.
Cross, we cross. When I say cross, we cross. Everyone line up.
When are we crossing?
We're going to hit the same piece, okay? Ready? 3, 2, 1, cross, cross, cross.
We crossing.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Press 3, press 3.
What the fuck is this, bro? Hit the piece! Hit the piece! Hit the piece, guys! Throw it at the piece! Come on! Throw it at the piece!
The
Don't
fuck
hit
is
the
this
fucking
rock?
Keep going, you'll kill it, you'll kill it, you'll kill it, you'll kill it. Throw, throw, throw.
Yeah, spoiler alert, they didn't kill it. So this was a very annoying mechanic. A lot of large regiments did this. Everyone hated it. And thankfully, in update 158.6.1, which was around August last year, the devs patched it out. And hopefully never to see the light of day again. But at least that's what a border hotel was. It was a bunker base that was built next to a border base that was cheating the rapid decay zone mechanics to basically have a structure there that doesn't decay, and the moment you cross the border, all the AI defenses would just light up and murder you. And it was very, very hard to attack into it. You basically had to suicide tanks to get any foothold into a region, or you would have to wait until the very end of the tech tree where you could build railstorm cannons, which have the ability to shoot across the border. Very annoying mechanic. I'm very glad it's gone. I was a big advocate against this mechanic, and I hated both large regiments on both the colonial side and the warden side who did this mechanic, and I'm really glad it's gone. And we're looking forward, hopefully, to never see it again. But that's what border hotels are. You get to see exactly how they functioned, and let's just hope they never come back. Okay, that's basically the end of this video. I yapped on for like 35 minutes. So please feel free to ask any questions about the zoo mechanic or the invasion bonus or border hotels. And if you're looking for more content like this, hopefully a little bit shorter because I do tend to talk a lot, feel free to suggest it in the comments and I'll be happy to answer it. But that's it for me for today. Thanks so much for listening in, and hopefully now you understand these mechanics a little bit better.